This is our video for February 24th, the second Sunday in Lent 2013. And I wanted to send you a video because we're still going to meet, even though our primary purpose in meeting will be to celebrate Ben and Rachel's the upcoming birth of their daughter. And so you'll notice that I named our lecture Babies, Covenant, and Cross, because when you hear the story from Genesis and when you hear what's at stake, you cannot escape that what is being promised has a lot to do with babies. So as we get together and celebrate the baby on Sunday, we're going to do a little bit of theological reflection. And part of the reason we're doing it this way is a reminder that, learning about God, integrating faith and theology is not just a matter for the classroom, but it's really how do we interpret our life in the light of God. So there's going to be a lot of talk of babies, and we're going to be celebrating a baby this Sunday. So it'll be a fun way for us to learn and be together. Well, the first reading on Sunday is going to talk to us about a fellow named Abram, and you probably know him later on in the story as Abraham. Our reading is from Genesis 15 on Sunday, and his name changes in Genesis 17 when the covenant is also marked with circumcision. And the change in name gives a clue to the change in meaning of his life. So the name Abram means exalted father. The name Abraham means father of many. One of the things for you to remember is the Bible loves wordplay. The Bible loves words that sound alike but mean two different things. And so these little twists in the name are significant and are something to pay attention to. Here's your little 15-second Hebrew lesson. Whenever you see this prefix, and it's Ab, or in Hebrew Av, it means father. So any name that has Ab means father, or has father in it. So Abram, Abraham, Abel, Abimelech. Sometimes the biblical names are hard off the English tongue, but when you kind of unlock them a little bit, you see why they mean what they mean. The great thing about the story on Sunday is it's about a baby. Sometimes when we talk about promises, it's like you have a lawyer who comes up to you and says, well, actually, if you read the promise in this light, you can understand that God has fully met his terms and owes you nothing. But that's not the case. In Genesis 15, as it relates to Abram's call and God's promise, if the baby shows up, then God has met the promise. If there is no baby, then it didn't happen. There's no gray area. There's either a baby or there's not a baby. And Abram, if he's honest, doesn't see that it's possible. Abram sees it as an impossibility, biologically impossible. And so you'll hear Abram say, you know what, God, I'd be fine if you just allow me to adopt the head of my household, Eliezer of Damascus, because there ain't going to be no baby. To which God has other ideas. Now, one of the things that we want to lift up to for your learning is the idea of covenant. Covenant is really a central concept for the Old Testament and for the life between God and his people. And in fact, the great covenant formula is God's part of the contract is I will be God, I will be your God, and the human side is, okay, we will be your people. And so a covenant is very much like a contract, but there's more at stake. As we'll hear later on about the story, it's a matter of life and death. And a covenant is something you cut. That's the verb that the Bible uses. God's going to cut a covenant with Abram. Now I want to show you a few different features of other parts of the readings for Sunday that this will then reflect light into. One of the great images from the Gospel on Sunday is the image of Jesus saying, how often I have desired to gather you, Jerusalem, like a mother hen gathers her children under her wings. Now, I don't live on a farm, and I didn't grow up on a farm, and probably none of us, unless there's some secret poultry in the congregation, have chickens, and so I wanted you to see this picture because it's really kind of a touching picture of a mother protecting her children. And in fact, there's a longing in Jesus' voice, this is what I wanted to do, but you wouldn't let me do that. Now you have to remember, Jesus goes off talking about Jerusalem and talking about that he will have to die there, as the prophets have died, after some people come and warn him about Herod. And the Herod that is being discussed at the time is the same Herod who cut off the head of John the Baptist. There are actually 4 Herods in the New Testament, and it's kind of difficult to keep them straight. It's like talking about George Foreman and all of his children named George. The first Herod, Herod the Great, is the Herod that tried to kill Jesus as a baby, and he dies very soon after that. The second Herod, and it's any miracle that he survived his father's wrath, is Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas is the Herod that we have in the story on Sunday. It is the Herod that cut off the head of John the Baptist. The next two Herods, who were friends with Caligula, the emperor of Rome, are Herod Agrippa I and II, and they have a part in Acts dealing with the martyrdom of some of the apostles and also the story of Paul. So there are four Herods spread out over the New Testament, and sometimes we just think, gosh, this Herod guy lived a long time, he keeps appearing. It's actually four different people. Now, if you remember from Sunday's reading last week, where we said, my father was a wandering Aramean, we were talking about Abram. And so here's the city of Ur in modern-day Iraq, and you'll see the journey that he took. Abram goes north, and then he heads west, and actually Haran is where Abram settled for a while, and he still had family. So Jacob went back to Haran to get a wife. Ended up with two wives, but to get a wife. He comes down into the land of Canaan, ended up in Egypt, ends up back in the land of Canaan. And so Abram is a wanderer who's kind of following God's call, and he's really a pilgrim until God makes good on the promise. And this becomes central for us, that we are pilgrims on the earth, trusting that God will make good on promises made to us. But as Abraham finds out, sometimes you wait a long time for the fruit of the promise. Now, if you get a chance to read chapter 15, which I would recommend you do, Abram and God have this little interchange where Abram says, God, look, I'm too old to have a baby. I guess I'll take Eliezer, that's fine. And then God says, no, look up at the stars. If indeed you can count them, so shall your offspring be. Now, what's really important, and what I want to highlight for you now, is verse 6. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So God has just told Abram, your descendants are going to be greater than the stars in the sky. You don't have to adopt anyone. You are going to have the baby, which will be the promise. And so this verse is really key for the Christian as we talk about what it means when God wants us to have a righteous life. You'll notice, Abraham merely believes that God's promise will come true. So, God makes a promise. This is God's work. God does the work. God does the work. So we'll say work. God does that. The human, in this case Abram receives the promise in faith. And what that means is Abram says, yes, God, I believe that you will do what you said you did. And then it's credited to him as righteousness. Abram is called a righteous person not because of what he does. It's not what Abram does. It's what God does. Abram's righteousness is rooted in God's work. And this is key for the Christian who wants to understand, what is my life in Jesus? We are righteous not because of what we've done, but because of what God has done for us in Jesus. And that's where our righteousness comes from. And so this sense of righteousness isn't kind of, yes, you have kept the moral code, you have kept the abstract moral code. Rather, you have lifted up, or you have participated in, or you have been faithful to the relationship. Now think about that. That's very different than how we usually think in terms of our terms of righteous. Faithful to relationship. Abram doesn't do the right thing. He merely receives that, yes, God, I believe that you will keep your promise. And verse 6 is something that is significant for Paul and is significant for Christian theology, and the Lutherans especially love it when we talk about Abram and Abraham receiving righteousness because they have believed. Now, after God talks to him about the baby, yes, you will have babies, lots of them, more than all the stars in the sky. Then God goes and makes a covenant. And this covenant is very important. And for those of you who listen to the story, it's very strange. Because then God says, not only are you going to have a baby, but I'm going to give you the land. And Abram says, O Lord, how can I know that I will gain the land? And then God says, bring me 3 animals. The first is going to be a heifer. The second, a goat. The third, a ram. A heifer, a goat, and a ram, all 3 years old. So they're each 3 years old. And then God says, in addition to that, bring me 2 birds. So I guess we could have said 5 animals, but really kind of 3 beasts and 2 birds. And then God says, I want you to cut this in half, cut this one in half, cut this one in half, and place their parts almost like a little runway. Make it so that half the heifer is here, half the heifer is here, half the goat's here, half the goat's here, half the ram is here, half the ram is here. A bird is here, a bird is here. And then as you hear, Abram does that. He makes this little runway, and then he sits off to the side, and animals come, and he has to kind of bat them away because the carrion birds want to chew on the various creatures. And he doesn't cut the birds in half, he just puts one here and one here. So night falls, and a darkness falls. Abram goes into a deep sleep, almost like a kind of death, and the presence of God comes down like a fire, and the presence of God passes down through the midst. The presence of God passes through the midst of these creatures. And this is how God makes or cuts covenant. Now, if you're reading the story, you might be like, what? Why do they cut animals in half? Why does the presence of God represented as fire, why does God's presence come through the middle, and Abram just sits over here? Well, it would appear that when people from where Abram came from made a covenant with one another, especially a solemn covenant, they would do exactly what you see happening in Genesis. They would cut the animals in half, and this kind of violent, sort of gross action is a sign that if you break the promise, so may this happen to you. Basically, if you break the promise, your life is at stake. So this isn't like, hey, guys, we entered into this contract, but it really doesn't matter. Your very life is at stake. And so to walk in between there is to say, yes, I promise you, and I will put my life on the line. I swear to you on my life. Now notice, God is the only one who passes through. Abram doesn't. Abram just sits over here and watches the whole thing in the deep sleep. And so God is willing to put himself on the line for the sake of the promise. And that's where we get to this business of the cross. So if the covenantal formula is God is one party, humans are the second party, it would appear that if humans are the ones who don't keep the relationship, that humans are the ones whose lives are at stake. But notice what happens in the story. God sacrifices himself for the sake of the relationship. So God has to keep his end of the bargain, and then God comes to us in Jesus so that through Jesus human beings might keep their end of the bargain so that the covenant might be kept. Now let me say that again. God is faithful. God keeps promise, so we can say, yes, God, check, you kept your part of the bargain. Then we see human history. We read the Bible and we say, humans, did you keep your part of the bargain? No. Well, then how are we going to be in relationship with God? Well, God will come and fill the human part. So Jesus comes, and then we say, yes, check. We are now faithful. God fulfills both roles. And like what we saw with Abraham, God puts his own life up as a ransom. God puts his own life on the cross up for our redemption. And so human beings participate in God's life through Jesus. And this is another very kind of classic and simple truth of the Christian faith. We don't relate to God directly because we can't, because we're not faithful. But Jesus, who is faithful with God, has opened up the way for us. So we go through Jesus to relate to God. And so when Jesus is lamenting over Jerusalem, and when Jesus is kind of presenting himself as the mother hen, oh, how I've longed to gather you, the people in Jerusalem say, oh, how we long to nail you to a cross. We don't want to be gathered by you. We want to murder you. And that's precisely because human beings don't think, A, that they're faithless in the relationship, and B, that they need anyone to get to God. And unfortunately, whether you like it or not, that's kind of what the data says as it relates to the story of the Bible. All right, well, in summary then, let's just review. There's the idea that God does the impossible with a baby. So we'll call this baby impossible. But what is being done is God is keeping promise. So even when it appears that it'll be impossible for God to keep promise, God does the impossible, and it's a baby. So as we celebrate Ben and Rachel's baby on Sunday, we'll be talking about some of these questions as part of the shower. How God has been faithful and kept promise. On the second part of this, I want you to think about the human requirement in the covenant, the human part of the covenant in Jesus, right? Because I said that's the only way it works. What does it mean when we say, yes, God, we will be your people? What does that mean for you as an individual? What does that mean for your family? Yes, God, we will be your people. We will be your people. I put family, but we can put family/people, because in Jesus we are the family of God. What does that mean for you? Third, think about the promises that you've made in your life. What promises have you kept? What promises have you broken? What promises might be renewed? So, what promises have you kept? What promises have you broken? What promises might be renewed? So you could renew your baptism and the promise God makes to you. You could renew your marriage vows. You could renew your commitment to your children. You could renew a commitment that you have in your business. Promises kept, promises broken, promises that can be renewed. I look forward to being with you on Sunday, celebrating Ben and Rachel's child, and looking at how it is that God keeps promise, cuts covenant, and even sacrifices himself that indeed we might share the life God has made for us.